I've seen all sorts of allegations about passives. I'll just review 5 of them for you very briefly. We'll just consider how serious these are as criticisms of passive clauses. We've already seen that people who use them actually can't identify passive clauses, so that in a sense they don't know what they're talking about. But they allege that passives are first verbose and wordy. Second, that they're dull and static instead of being lively and dynamic. Third, that they're sneaky or evasive concerning agency and responsibility. Fourth, that they are feeble and weak rather than bold and strong. And fifth, that they're avoided by good writers. All of these are unsupported and I think clearly false. First, consider verbose and wordy. The maximum number of extra words that you get just because you use a passive is 2. You get an instance of be in at least some passives. And if you choose a long passive, you get 1 instance of by. So those 2 little monosyllables are added in some cases. But if you have a look at the numbers in real text, most of the passives that occur are short passives. They don't have the by phrase, so there isn't an extra by in there. And some of them don't have a be. And the total amount that you could save if you avoided all passive clauses is roughly 0. The maximum would be something like 0.6% in the total number of words needed, but usually the saving would be approximately 0. So we can forget about the idea of passives as wordy and lengthy. Now the allegation about dullness and staticness. In the Wikipedia article on the President John F. Kennedy, the section headed Assassination begins, President Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas at 12:30 p.m. Central Standard Time on November 22nd, 1963. It's as sharp and shocking and direct as you could possibly want. There's no sense in which it would be an improvement to replace that by some active clause, which would have to have a mention of Lee Harvey Oswald, who wasn't identified until much later. It's absolutely as sharp and clear and dynamic as you could imagine. It's shocking. The charge of it being dull and static is just nonsense. How about the charge of passives being sneaky and evasive? This takes us back, I think, to Sherry Roberts's astonishing suggestion that a sentence written in the active voice is the straight-shooting sheriff who faces the gunslinger proudly and fearlessly. It's honest and straightforward, you know where you stand. Whereas a sentence written in passive voice is the shifty desperado who tries to win the gunfight by shooting the sheriff in the back, stealing his horse and sneaking out of town. Sherry Roberts gives 2 examples, and I will say this for her. They are accurate in that the active one is an active and the passive one is a passive. She gives, the committee will review all applications in early April, and the passive is, in early April, all applications will be reviewed by the committee. So that's fine. By the way, she unthinkingly uses a passive when she says the bare passive adjunct written in passive voice when she's talking about this. But think about her charge about dishonesty, evasiveness, and shooting the sheriff in the back and all that stuff. In early April, all applications will be reviewed by the committee. What is left inexplicit there? It's absolutely clear on who is going to review the applications, the committee. The business about sneakiness and evasiveness, doesn't even apply to the very examples that she gives. And often it doesn't apply at all. I'm not saying that passives, short passives, couldn't be used that way, but in hundreds and hundreds of cases that you find, they're perfectly unexceptional. In hundreds and hundreds of cases, there is no evasiveness at all in using a short passive. And in the ones that Sherry Roberts cites, she gives a long passive to which her allegation isn't relevant at all. What about the charge that passives are feeble, ineffective, and weak rather than bold and muscular and strong? As a check on that, what I did was to take down my copy of the first book by Lee Child about Jack Reacher, the tough, ruthless military policeman who keeps breaking people's knees and sometimes their necks, and open it at page 1. The book was called Killing Floor, and it's in first person as narrated by Jack Reacher himself. And the first sentence is, "I was arrested in Eno's diner." This is tough guy prose in absolutely its purest form. The way Lee Child writes, the sentences are about this long, and they come at you like a fist hitting you between the eyes. It is ridiculous to say that there's something weak, ineffectual, and non-muscular about "I was arrested in Eno's diner." What's more, to replace that by an active would have been rhetorically hopeless. Lee Child knows how to write active sentences, and he knows how to write about violent action. And in this case, the point is that Jack Reacher has no idea who is arresting him or why. He doesn't know if this is the FBI, the local police, the sheriff, whatever. He just knows he was sitting eating his eggs and bacon, and he was suddenly arrested. It would ruin everything to reveal in the first sentence of the book what was actually going on. You have to find that out later. It's just a silly claim that passives are weak. One more point. What about the idea that the best writers really avoid passives? That's implicit in all of this nonsense about how you should write in the active voice, as if passives were some kind of poison. Who do you want to pick as a fine writer? That will differ, I suppose, according to different people's tastes. But H.G. Wells is presumably a reasonable writer to pick. Let's just look at the first paragraph of his book, The War of the Worlds. It begins like this. "No one would have believed in the last years of the 19th century that this world was being watched keenly and closely by intelligences greater than man's, and yet as mortal as his own. That as men busied themselves about their various concerns, they were scrutinized and studied, perhaps almost as narrowly as a man with a microscope might scrutinize the transient creatures that swarm and multiply in a drop of water." There are just 6 transitive verbs in that paragraph, and 50% of them are heads of passive clauses. So maybe that's an anomaly. Suppose we took E.B. White himself, the co-author of The Elements of Style, and we look at the introduction, The Elements of Style, the book that says write in the active voice. The introduction that E.B. White wrote to the current edition of The Elements of Style opens like this. "At the close of the First World War, when I was a student at Cornell, I took a course called English 8. My professor was William Strunk, Jr. A textbook required for the course was a slim volume called The Elements of Style, whose author was the professor himself. The year was 1919. The book was known on the campus in those days as the Little Book, with the stress on the word little. It had been privately printed by the author. There are 5 transitive verbs in that passage. 80% of them are in the passive. E.B. White, who tells you what his professor told him, that you shouldn't use the passive voice is using them 80% of the opportunities he has in the opening words of his own introduction to the book. What can we conclude here? The people telling you not to use the passive often don't know what they're talking about. In fact, dozens of times I've spotted that they don't know how to tell what's a passive and what isn't. And the things that they say about passive clauses are completely wrong. Their grammatical description is wrong and misses out most of the detail. They never mention the information structure restriction on passives. And the allegations they make about how they're weak or evasive or whatever, they don't stand up to even a minute of close scrutiny. What I'm telling you is not that you should use passives all the time. You shouldn't do anything all the time. I'm just saying that there is no value at all to someone who wants to write better prose than they write at the moment in being told, don't use passives. The trick, and it's not that easy to implement, is to use passives just when a passive is right. That's what you need. And there's subtlety in learning how to write so that it sounds effective and you get across what you want to get across. It's not easy to write really well, but it's not going to get any easier when you're told don't use passives at all, which is a ridiculous piece of advice, especially if you're told that by people who can't tell a passive from an active anyway, and whose beliefs about passive clauses are almost entirely mistaken.